If you've been playing games long enough, you're bound to have played a game that let you down. Whether a friend overhyped it or the game simply didn't live up to your expectations, we all get disappointed sooner or later in this hobby. So in today's video, I'll be counting down my top 5 most disappointing JRPGs. Now I want to make something crystal clear. I don't hate or even dislike any of these games on this list. In fact, most of these games I finished and quite enjoyed. However, they all let me down in one way or another. So be sure to get that salt ready, and if you enjoy JRPG content like this, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Starting this list off, I have Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. Hey, stop writing that comment. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Remember what I just said a few seconds ago? I don't hate or even dislike any of these games on this list. Well, that's probably the most true here. I actually enjoyed Xenoblade Chronicles quite a bit. The story had me hooked, it had fantastic music, and the combat was pretty solid. That all being said, I kept waiting to be blown away. All I ever heard about the Wii version was how it was such a masterpiece and one of the greatest JRPGs of all time. So going in, I had pretty high expectations. Leading up to the Definitive Edition's release, I had already finished Xenoblade Chronicles 2, its prequel Torn of the Golden Country, and Xenoblade Chronicles X. They were all fine enough games, but all had their problems and certainly weren't masterpieces. As I began my adventure with Xenoblade Chronicles, I was enjoying it and really had no complaints. But then very quickly I noticed Xenoblade committing one of my biggest pet peeves in open world games. Big, but empty. Yeah, the levels are huge and some of them even look particularly cool, but there's nothing to do in them. You basically just walk around and fight monsters. In other open world games like Breath of the Wild, for example, there's always something to catch your interest, like a shrine or small encampment to keep you wanting to explore. In Xenoblade, there really isn't anything like that. There's no secret weapons to find, no Terry Town, no island where you lose all your gear, just a lot of running and fighting. And the combat is fine, but I felt like it got old pretty quickly and was really only engaging during boss fights. Something else I want to mention is the twists in the story. I'm not going to spoil them here, don't worry, but as the game came to a close, it just felt like I was getting thrown twist after twist. The first few were cool, but then it just became exhausting and it was like, alright guys, I get it. One last thing I found really odd was the hour discrepancy between the Wii and the Switch versions. There's an almost 20-hour difference in completion times. And after talking with friends who played both versions, they said it was because of how bad the map was in the Wii version. This only makes all these masterpiece claims that much more baffling to me. Did everyone just have Stockholm Syndrome? I mean, guys, I know it was a dark period for console JRPGs. I remember, I was there. But everyone was willing to put up with an extra 20 hours of BS and call it a masterpiece? I just don't get it. Xenoblade Chronicles is a great game, but got way overhyped for me over the years and left me a little disappointed. I'm sure most of you expected Final Fantasy 15 on this list sooner or later, and for good reason. It's impossible for a game like this to live up to 10 years of anticipation. Originally announced as Final Fantasy Versus 13 in 2006 and eventually releasing in the fall of 2016, Final Fantasy 15 had a lot to live up to, and maybe unfairly so. Not only did it have its own hype to contend with, but was also trying to make up for a trilogy of Final Fantasy 13 games that left fans disappointed by the end. When it finally did release, it was fairly well received, both scoring well with critics and quickly becoming one of the best-selling games in the series. I'll admit, I got really caught up in the hype and destroyed this game, not just finishing it but getting the Platinum Trophy on PlayStation 4. After having some time away from the game and looking at it objectively though, it certainly has its problems. The most glaring issue was the story. It just felt incomplete. Not to mention the fact that Square Enix wanted to make this release a multimedia project that included an animated series, several mobile games, and a feature-length CG film. Without delving into spoilers, I remember seeing Kingsglaive in theaters opening night. By the end, I was completely shocked by the story pieces they decided to include in it and essentially have them be nothing more than throwaway lines in the main game. These other projects, while cool, took away from the game's story in big ways and made for a worse experience. Then of course there were the bits of the story where characters would leave that were clearly set up for DLC later, and sections that just felt unfinished. There were whole nations mentioned in trailers that you never even go to. But for me personally, there were 2 gameplay sequences that never made the final cut that really left me disappointed. The first is this section from the E3 2013 trailer where Square Enix re-revealed the game as Final Fantasy 15. This sequence looked so cool, with Noctis teleporting all over the environment and taking part in this epic battle. In the final game, it's absolutely nothing like this, and the battle with Leviathan is pretty lame. Maybe the worst boss fight in the whole game. The second sequence is the invasion of Insomnia from a trailer back when it was still Final Fantasy Versus 13. It seemed like the perfect way to kick the game off where your home is invaded and you need to escape. Instead, this is how the game begins. Real exciting, Square. In the years since, Square Enix has added tons of content to Final Fantasy 15, including the ability to control the other characters in your party, a multiplayer mode, and tons of other quality of life updates. I'll always remember my time with this game fondly, but at the same time, it's hard not to wonder what could have been. Man, White Knight Chronicles 2. This one hurts. Where to even begin? Well, let me start by giving you a bit of context. The PlayStation 3 was a wasteland for JRPGs. People hated Final Fantasy XIII, Dragon Quest and Kingdom Hearts didn't even have a numbered release this entire generation, and the JRPGs we were getting were just mediocre. To say the least, JRPG fans were starving. Then comes along White Knight Chronicles 2, by level 5. These are the guys that made Dark Cloud, Rogue Galaxy, and Dragon Quest VIII. They just don't miss. Well, I was clearly wrong about that. Look, if I'm being honest, I probably didn't give White Knight Chronicles 2 a fair chance, but it just left one heck of a sour first impression. The game has this weird MMO-style combat that I didn't really care for, had a big emphasis on online multiplayer, and it just looks... This is the best you could do, level 5? Really? You gave us games that looked like this, and you made this? I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. I've been really harsh to White Knight Chronicles 2 over the years, and I always thought it was just my own personal experience that left me not enjoying the game, but having looked up its pitiful Metacritic score, I feel a little bit vindicated. At the end of the day, White Knight Chronicles 2 just wasn't what I was looking for, and I expected so much more from a talented studio like Level 5. Thankfully, they atoned for their sins a few years later with arguably their best game, Ni no Kuni: Wrath of the White Witch, and they haven't let us down since. Or have they? Oh yeah, Tales of Zysteria. I've been waiting to rip into this one on the channel. This is gonna be fun. Leading up to Tales of Zysteria, we had Tales of Grace's F, Tales of Exilia, and Tales of Exilia 2. All solid games, but the Tales formula was starting to get really stale by this point, and it was time for the series to step its game up. The first trailer for Tales of Zysteria promised as much, showcasing an open world, seamless combat, and a cool looking cast of characters. While all this was in the final game, it just was executed so sloppily. Let me just say straight up, making this an open world game was a bad idea. Or rather, the development team just clearly didn't know how to make it a good one. There's so much running around in this game, just so much running. Like I said with Xenoblade Chronicles, big doesn't equal good, and in Zysteria's case, big equals bad. Now let's talk about the combat, because it's actually pretty cool. It feels great, and being able to fuse with other party members is really neat. The problem comes in with how battles begin. In past Tales games, you would transition into a battle arena that was clearly designed with the combat system in mind. In Zysteria, you seamlessly begin battles on the world map. That's cool on paper, however, the designers didn't really take this into account very well when designing levels. Oftentimes, you would have to fight the camera, which made for some clunky encounters. Also, the dungeons. These continue to be the same boring, cookie-cutter dungeons that just aren't interesting. Lastly, we have to talk about Alicia. Leading up to the game's release, she was being touted as almost a second protagonist, being showcased quite a bit in trailers. But when the game came out, oh boy, let's just say Japan was pissed. Essentially, she leaves the party early on in the game, only to be sold later as story DLC. Fans were not happy, at all. In the end, Tales of Zysteria was a mediocre disappointment. The next game in the series, Tales of Arise, releases this September and also has a lot of hype riding on it. No pressure, guys. And finally, at number 1, I have Ni no Kuni 2: Revenant Kingdom. Trust me when I say nobody wanted to love this game more than me. I was absolutely obsessed with the original Ni no Kuni on PS3. It was the first game I ever imported, and I ended up playing quite a lot of it with my friend who spoke Japanese. If you've seen my top 10 JRPGs video, then you know Ni no Kuni is one of my all-time favorites the genre has ever seen. Simply put, I adored that game. Fast forward to the 2015 PlayStation experience, and they announced a sequel. I was actually in the crowd at PSX that year and was hyped beyond belief. And then the game came out, and it was actually pretty good. Great even. However, my expectations were sky high, and there were a few things that just let me down. The first was the story. It was okay and told in a kinda clunky way. You don't even start off playing as the main character Evan, but rather Roland, a president from another world. Then at the end of the chapters, you get these weird recap sections with a mysterious character that, to me, didn't really pay off at the end. Whether this is Bandai Namco or Level 5 directly, I'm not sure, but the sporadic voice acting was so jarring. You'll be in a cutscene with full voice acting, and then out of nowhere it just stops, or certain characters just aren't voiced. On top of this, none of the characters are very endearing. The original Ni no Kuni had a colorful cast of heartwarming characters that you grew to care about. I honestly didn't really care about any in Ni no Kuni 2. Another big letdown for me was the music. The arrangements aren't nearly as memorable, nor are any of the other tracks. Joe Hisaishi really hit the first game's score out of the park, so he had a high bar to hit with the sequel. Sadly, it just didn't live up. I will admit that the combat is absolutely fantastic, if not a little simple. It switched from a semi-turn-based one with Pokemon-like familiars to an action system where you directly control your characters. The main problem was it was just way too easy. Even enemies 10 levels higher than you never really posed that much of a threat. There were also these weird skirmish battles that felt undercooked, and a town building mechanic that, while addicting, felt overemphasized in a game where I just wanted a gripping story. In the end, Ni no Kuni 2 is far from a bad game, but I just walked away from it wanting a little something more. Now if you're in the mood for some JRPG goodness that won't leave you disappointed, be sure to check out this video right here. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.